What's up guys, Dylan with the Wash Nerds, and we built a water-fed pull cart about 1.5 years ago that looked something like this. And it's been great to us, but it's also really heavy. So when we had the need for a second water-fed pull cart, I wanted to improve the design a little bit and make it a lot more lightweight. So that's why we built one that looks like this, and that's what we'll be showing you guys how to make in today's video. Alright guys, so starting off the actual build here, we are going to be using just a standard 40/40 size RO membrane housing. So this is just a stainless steel one I picked up off Amazon. And that kit actually comes with 2 caps. So this will be the top cap, the other one will be the bottom cap. And you have 2 O-rings in the package, so you just slip those on over the cap as shown. So you should have 2 per. And then for the actual internals for this housing, we are going to be using an Xero HF5, and that is a 40/40 size RO membrane. The reason I picked this one, even though it's a little bit more expensive, is just because this is the highest flow rating out of pretty much all the membranes that I could find. And that's really important because your RO membrane is kind of like your choke point for the whole system. So if you cheap out on the RO membrane, you're probably going to end up with overall less performance. So anyways, that's why I selected this particular one. I'll also link a cheaper option just in case you don't quite have the funds for this one at the moment, but it's really not that much more. Anyways, so the first step in assembling this part of the system is going to be just applying Vaseline to our O-ring. Vaseline does 2 kind of purposes. You could also use something like silicone, but it's going to help create a good seal with the actual O-ring itself and the wall of the membrane housing. And it's also going to make this a ton easier to assemble. If you've watched my previous video, you know that I kind of struggled putting together this housing, but I've actually already pre-assembled this one and then took it back apart for the video. And it goes together much easier. You'll also notice there's a couple O-rings in the internals, and that is for the tip of the actual membrane itself. So you can see that tip there, that is going to be sliding into that. So you'll want to make sure to lube that up as well. Alright, so now that that part is done, I can go ahead and start assembling this housing. So I'm going to take one of these, and again, these are identical, so it doesn't really matter, but I can just take one of these and then kind of lay it flat. And I'm just going to press this housing onto this. So you can see how butter smooth that went on. Last time I kind of really fought these because I think I just didn't have enough Vaseline on. So next I will be putting in the Xero housing or membrane. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this in. You will notice there's a slight difference in the kind of the outer rings of these. So I'm going to put the one without this lip at the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide that in. And you should feel it kind of click into place. We'll know in a second if it's truly in as I put this top cap on. So these are facing right here. So I'm just going to hold my finger. And this doesn't have to be perfect, just trying to make things a little easier. So there we go, that's it. So your RO membrane housing is assembled minus all of the ports, so let's start on the ports next. My 2 components for the top cap are going to be a 3/4 barb elbow to 3/4 MPT thread, and then just a 1/2 inch cap, so that'll be for our center port. For this build, I'm just going to go ahead and use standard PTFE thread tape. So this is just Blue Monster. You can also use a thread sealant, which I'll link down below. I actually kind of prefer the thread sealant, but the tape is all I have on hand right now. So this is just what I'm going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and seal these up. All right, so here we go. We've got 1 to 2 wraps of thread tape around all the threads. Nothing crazy. And I'm going to go ahead and put the barb in first, or I should say elbow barb, just because this is going to rotate around. So I don't want that interfering with the cap, making it harder to tighten. So just hand thread this in. And I should mention that these caps are pretty fragile. I mean, you're not going to break it with hand tight, but be very careful when you put the wrench on it. They don't need a ton of strength to actually seal. So quite honestly, you could probably get away with hand tight. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that there for now. And then I'm going to put my center cap in. So I've got both these in now. So notice the orientation of the elbow. And I might rotate that a little bit out after we get the sediment filter mounted. But that's just general direction of where the sediment filter is going to be on the front of the cart. So that's where I'll start with this orientation. Just for ease of kind of working on things, I'm going to wait on the bottom cap till a little bit later. So that way I can still keep this RO membrane upright. I lied, let's go ahead and do the bottom cap on the RO membrane housing before we get to everything else. So for the discharge port, which is going to be the 3/4 port down there, I have this little hose bib. So this is 3/4 MPT, and then the outlet here is 3/4 garden hose thread. And I like the valve on there, just so that way I can kind of fine tune my outflow and my bypass. That's really important for getting the right ratio and kind of maximizing your efficiency. And just since I like a little bit more control, I'm going to go ahead and take this garden hose thread and put a female garden hose thread to 3/8 barb on there. So that'll allow me to just run a outlet hose for my discharge. That way I can kind of direct it away from the cart. For our clean water side, I actually have a 1/2 inch MPT to 3/4 inch barb fitting, and this will actually go directly into another 3/4 to 3/4 elbow that'll run up to our DI tank. So real quick, as I'm finishing up tightening that, so here is our top side. So this is again going to the front of the cart. So if I flip this over, I have my discharge running, so the barb for the discharge hose is actually coming back, which means that valve will kind of be on the front side. I think that's just kind of best because I'll have hand access in front, and that way my discharge hose isn't routing back around. So again, you can kind of route that however you want, or not use a discharge hose at all. And then I just have my 1/2 inch fitting there, which like I said, will go to a 90. Before we move on from the membrane real quick, we are going to put the clamps on. So you just have 2 clamp pieces that hold the cap to the actual housing, and you don't need to go crazy tightening these down. Just make sure you're kind of snugging them down nice and even. That way you don't get, you know, kind of crooked like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now, and then we'll move on to the other parts. This is the sediment tank filter that we'll be using for this build. This is actually only a 10 by 2.5 or 10 by 3 inch cartridge housing, and we will be using the 10 by 2.5 filter size, and this is just a standard sediment filter. Again, everything will be linked in the description below. So I'm just going to focus on the cap for right now because we will want to leave the actual housing and filter off until after we get the cap all mounted to the cart, and it'll just make things a little bit easier down the road. So on our outlet, notice there is an in and an out marking on this cap. So on the outlet side, that's what's going to be running up to the inlet of our RO membrane. So I'm just going to use another 3/4 MPT to 3/4 barb elbow. So I'm going to go ahead and hand thread that in. And then on the inlet side, I'm going to go ahead and use a 3/4 MPT to 3/4 GHT female fitting, and this is what your garden hose will actually thread into. One thing to note, kind of what I've learned from our previous cart build, is I would actually put a quick connect on here, just that way you're not threading into that and then unthreading it, because that'll over time kind of loosen this fitting up and just be a nuisance. That's just one thing I noticed from our previous cart, so I felt like I'd pass that along, but it's not necessary. You know, we ran for probably a year on that cart without doing that. So I'm gonna go ahead and thread these in. And again, my cap will actually be sitting a little bit lower than the RO membrane, so I'm gonna kind of point this barb up when I go to finally tighten it. So I really do think hand threading is probably just fine on these. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and set the filter and cap aside, and we'll move on to the DI tank. This is the tank and the DI resin filter that we will be using for this build. So this is just a standard 10 by 4.5 filter housing. And then we have a tank for DI resin from Window Cleaning Resource. This actually came pre-filled, which is kind of nice. But this is one of the main weight savings off this build versus our previous build. Just downsizing this tank because we probably were a little bit overkill. I mean, we really haven't even had to change the resin on that other one, which has been nice, but it's also been a pain to lug around. So this is one of the key points I wanted to try shrinking. So we'll identify, how that affects our flow performance and our longevity. And obviously once I have those metrics, I will report back and let you guys know. So anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and just set this in the housing for now, put that off to the side so we can focus on building up our cap. So similar to the other cap, we have an inlet port and an outlet port. I actually had this backwards, that's the outlet port. So the inlet port is actually going to come in, and then, I don't know if you can see that on camera, that's kind of going to dump the water just into the general cavity. And then the outlet port is actually pulling it through the center region. So that'll be important when we go to put our DI resin filter in. Just kind of shows us which orientation that should actually be in. And these ports are actually 1-inch MPT, so I went ahead and found some fittings that will work for this. Our inlet is going to be coming from the bottom of our RO membrane. So what I've done for that is I got a 1-inch MPT fitting, male to a 3/4 inch female, and I'm just going to go ahead and screw that in. And then with that, I have a 3/4 inch barb to 3/4 inch MPT fitting. So this is the same one that we've used other places. So I'm just going to hand start that for now. On the other side, so I have a 1-inch MPT fitting to garden hose thread. So the reason for that is it's pretty tricky to find the right fittings for the outlet to our actual tube that we use to flow the clean water. So I had to kind of piece this together using standard garden hose. So I just have a male to male 3/4 garden hose thread fitting. And sorry, one thing to note real quick is this does have a gasket in it. So just be careful with that. Make sure it's not rolled or anything before you install this. And then this is the fitting that will actually connect to our line. So that is a 5/16 line fitting. And then we have our seal on the back side. So same situation, you have a gasket on there. But that's just going to thread right onto our GHT fitting. And I wanted to go with all brass, just that way, there's less chance of having issues in the field. But this has a nice on-off switch that, I don't really have to worry about that breaking because it is brass versus plastic. If I bump the cart or anything, it's got a lot less of a chance. So that is pretty much the completed cap. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up real quick and then we'll move on. Now to actually mount our RO membrane to our cart, we are going to use the little pads that it came with. So these kind of wrap the curvature of this housing. And then I'm placing that on the bottom crossbar as well as the top crossbar. And then I'm going to kind of try to align this so that way the membrane housing is as far up as I can shift it. So this will kind of be our limiting factor down here. And then to actually mount this, we just have 2 straps. So these just wrap around the housing. So we'll end up popping 2 holes, one on each side of this support on the upper and the lower portion. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and then show you guys what it looks like. Now that I've got my 4 holes drilled and our hardware test fit, I actually did go ahead and test fit this with the RO membrane in place just to make sure that everything was going to line up and to make sure that these bolts were going to be long enough, and everything looks great. So now I'm going to go ahead and take these out for the time being just to make sure that we can flip this over and work on the front side. So our mounting for our sediment filter next and our DI resin tank, just to make it a little bit easier without having to lay it on the back with that awkward membrane in the way. So one thing to note, these are M6 bolts that come with the membrane housing. So you'll want to drill a little bit oversized, and then I ended up tossing a washer on front just to help spread that load when we actually tighten down the bolts so it doesn't pull its way through the aluminum. This is fairly thin aluminum on this cart. Again, it's a super lightweight cart. So let's go over to the sediment filter next. All right, for this next part, I would recommend doing this on a flat surface like the floor. I have this thing perched like an inch from the edge, so it'll probably roll off mid-filming, but trying to give you guys the best view possible here. But what I went ahead and did is I bought these aluminum plates off Amazon. So these are an 1/8 inch thick, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches tall. And what that does is gives us a perfect surface to actually flush mount our bracket to. That'll hold our sediment filter, and then one for our DI resin tank. And the alternative was going to be drilling 2 holes in the same support that we use to mount our RO membrane to. So I already kind of didn't like that because that's a lot of load on that support alone, but also just the fact that we couldn't get all 4 holes for the plate mounted. So what I'm going to do instead is be using these 2 plates. I'm going to put 2 holes per side, so total of 4 mounting bolts holding the plate to the cart, and then I will use the 4 bolt holes from the actual mounting bracket to the tank itself, and that should hold everything nice and secure. So I'll give you guys some rough measurements after I get this figured out off camera, and then we'll be right back. For this top plate, I ended up just putting this just below the rivet that holds the top cross member on. And what I'm kind of doing, since I'm not bothering to clamp this thing down or really even take too careful measurements or anything, so I just overlaid this. I'm holding it down with my hand as I drill, and then as I get a hole complete, I'm just dropping a bolt in there to hold it tight. So these are 1/4 inch bolts, and that is, I believe, a 5/16 inch drill bit. So it fits pretty tight and keeps us nice and locked down. That way the rest of my holes are going to line up. If you try to drill these all and let this plate slide around without these bolts in place, then you're probably going to end up with everything misaligned. One thing to note on hardware is I have 8 1/4-20 by 2.5 bolts, and I have a washer on front and back, and then a nylon lock nut holding that tight. And then for the mounting bracket hardware, I have 8 1/4-20 bolts that are an inch long with a washer front and back plus a nylon lock nut as well. So I'll have all that listed in the description down below, so don't forget to check that out. And as you can see, I've got everything mounted now. So I've got my top plate and bracket in place, as well as my bottom plate and bracket. And for alignment, I just used the top edge of this plate right below the 2 rivets that hold the cross member in place. And then I lined the bracket for that piece up, maybe a 1/2 inch down from the top. It doesn't need to be precise. So the main thing here is just making sure that I have room to unscrew this filter. That way I can change out the internals whenever it gets old. And I've got plenty of room between here and the next bracket. And then same kind of principle down here. I just made sure I had enough space here, as well as that I wasn't going to interfere with the actual bottom. So I went ahead and just verified that. And then I went ahead and mounted this plate basically flush with the aluminum. That way it just looks nice and clean. But again, there's quite a bit of wiggle room, so you don't have to be precise with mounting that at all. Next step here will be to just unscrew the filter housings to make them a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the 4 holes in the top of the filter housings, in top of the caps I should say, to go ahead and mount these up to the brackets. Then we can flip this thing over, get our RO membrane attached, and start doing plumbing. I just located the hardware for the caps and everything is Phillips head, so you can go ahead and grab your favorite Phillips head screwdriver and start tightening these. Alright, and I've got both caps mounted now. So one thing to note is I do have the inlet for the garden hose on this back side. Then I have the outlet for our water fed pole hose on this side. that's just one thing I kind of wanted to improve on the last design. I set mine up both coming out the same side. It was just always annoying kind of having the hoses feeding in the same direction. I felt like both of them were either turning 90 or one was turning 180, kind of trying to get where I wanted to go. So I wanted opposite sides for this build. Okay, so it turns out that with the brackets and everything on, this actually doesn't sit very nice. So I ended up just propping the front end on a box. Looking at this though, I think you could actually do this step since I left the tires on the table instead of laying the back flat on the cart. I think you could actually go ahead and mount this before you do the filter mounts, and that would probably be easier. But again, I'm doing this for the first time, so making these mistakes for you. Anyways, I just pre-started the straps on the one side with the bolts. So I'll pull those through and then start the other side, and then I'm just going to tighten those down with a ratchet. And then we should be able to go ahead and screw on our filters and start running the hoses. We are ready to start plumbing this thing, and I'm going to start with the clean water outlet from the bottom of the RO membrane and the one that'll be feeding into our DI tank. Just to make sure that I've got the right clearance on everything, I'm going to go ahead and assemble our DI tank and then put the housing on, so that way I make sure I've got access to this without having to remove the hose. So this is what your DI resin will look like, and you'll want to make sure that this little seal's in there, and then the seal with the black piece is going to face up. So that'll sit in there just like that. And then we can go ahead and screw that in to our cap. And you should feel it kind of get snug as that O-ring seats. So I am going to start off with just a little jumper hose. This is maybe, I don't know, 3.5, 4 inches. And then that'll go directly to our elbow, which is just 3/4 to 3/4 elbow. And that'll basically get us out coming this way, so that way we can loop it up and directly onto this. This hose is pretty stiff, so I'm just gonna go ahead and use a heat gun. If you don't have a heat gun, you can either really force it. I've used WD-40 in the past just to lubricate it up a little bit so it slides on. You know, kind of whatever you want. I'll link a decent heat gun in the comment section. This one's actually just from Harbor Freight though. All right, I've got my little jumper hose on there now, and then I put 2 hose clamps on, just that way when I put this on the barb, I don't have to mess with attaching those after the fact. Also be mindful of which direction you end up putting the little drive going, that way you got access to it. Now we are ready to attach the end of this, so I'm not going to cut my piece yet. I'm going to go ahead and just hit this with the heat gun and get it on that other barb, and then run it up to here so I can get a good length. Alright, so I just finished up running the 3/4 line from the DI tank down to the bottom of the RO membrane. Left this a little bit longer than I should have, but I'd rather be too long than too short, just in case we do have to trim it later. It's no big deal. So I'll move on to finishing up the 3/4 line, running from the sediment filter up to the top of the RO membrane. I'll drop this down just so you guys can see it. Alright guys, that's pretty much it for the whole build. The only thing left is just putting on the little reject water hose for the bottom of the RO membrane, which is really kind of optional. And then we'll jump right into some testing. Alright, so we did get the chance to try this thing out tonight, cleaning up the windows at a Mercedes dealership, but unfortunately my TDS meter is broken. So it was reading 00 before the screen actually peeled off and I got water in there. So you just have to take my word for it, but this unit's great so far and plenty of flow for window cleaning, so we like it.
Well wire too much for you? Go ahead. I think it's some little